Hello and welcome back to episode 5. I don't know why I said it like we've done 1,000 episodes. It's not hard to count from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But welcome back to episode 5 of How We Got Here. The show where we talk about a topic, and it's pretty self-explanatory, wouldn't you think, Paul?
Yeah. I mean, we try to cover the background of it, try to get to the point of where we were a couple hundred years ago. In this case, when we're talking about American families, and then bring us up right to the modern day, and kind of look at where we were and where we are now,
and why. So I am one of your hosts, Jay. We've got Paul on the other mic, and sitting in, kind of offended me, but refused to be on the microphone, is Donna Esperanza Hope, the number 6 women jiu-jitsu in the world. She's amazing. Way prettier than you.
it puts us all to shame, really.
Yep. So, what's interesting? I kind of thought about this when my wife was the one who actually brought this up to me. She was like, you guys talk about different topics. Why don't you talk about where we're at in the world today in regards to the American family? Because the thought is there's been this kind of dynamic shift in what the American family looks like. Because when we actually start to look at this, when you go back to early times when essentially you needed a family to survive, right? You had mother, father, 18 kids working the farm. But not only that, but they were raised by not only the mom and the dad, but they were, the saying, right, it takes a village, right?
Right.
And that comes from somewhere, because back in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, you needed a village. There wasn't this modern life, this modern world. So whereas we come to today, and what you might think a modern family looks like today is significantly different than it was back in the 1800s, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, and you used the word dynamic shift. The American family has gone through a number of dynamic shifts, and that was one of the things when I was doing my research that was really kind of like new to me and something that surprised me. But say in the colonial era, and you kind of touched on this. Your typical family, you had a husband, a wife, you had biological children, and you also had the extended family.
Yeah.
And the extended family could be aunts, uncles, the grandparents, the whole ball of wax. And sometimes everybody lived in a house, and the house itself would be, by what we would consider modern standards, it'd be a small house. So they were all crammed in there together, and you'd have a small town, small village, and everybody was dependent on everybody for survival. So it was really kind of crazy. But one of the things that and also in that era, when you got married until until you died.
Till death do us part.
Till death do us part. And
unless you get fat. That's what my wife told me.
But they've also got this thing called coverture, and I don't know if you came across this word or not.
Yeah, it just happened 2020, right? 19. There's
the pandemic. Yeah, well, it's a different kind of thing.
Oh, okay. Oh, you said coverture, not COVID. Sorry.
And of course, you and I being lawyers, this is going to be kind of like a little wonky for some of the people out there, but it's weird because when a woman got married in that era, she basically lost all her rights. Her marriage. She basically, her legal existence disappeared when she got married. She couldn't own property. She couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't sue or be sued. And
couldn't work.
Couldn't work. The crazy thing about it is, even if her husband wanted to grant her property, it was disallowed, because the husband and wife were considered one entity, and it was the husband that was the legal entity. And so therefore, the way they looked at it back then, a husband would have been giving property to himself. So he couldn't even give his wife something if he wanted to.
I can tell you this right now. If I went upstairs and told my wife, "You're my property," I'd get a swift kick instantly.
Well, and I've got the number 6 over here. She'd choke me out if I tried to pull that one. So, you know.
That's Donna's new name, is number 6. There you go. But isn't that, I mean, that, it's interesting because back in those days, right, it was very much a patriarchal makeup.
Oh, definitely.
Now, without sounding misogynistic, and I'm not talking about women being property, but in those days, the way to earn money was to be very physical. There was a lot of manual labor, a lot of farming. So it makes sense that the man would have the power, right? And given that it was a very physical place, and just historically, men are going to be the more physical people. Now, obviously we live in a time now I have trouble with people who think about, oh, well, back in 400 years ago, this was bad and it's bad. Well, you're thinking with like today's brain,
Right.
You can't go back and think with 1800s brain and realize that yes or no, that was a bad thing to do. Now, of course, now do we know, or is it true that women are people and shouldn't be viewed as property? It is. But it kind of made sense back then to have the patriarchal makeup, given that in those times where it was a lot of farming, mainly farming,
right,
that the man made up the household.
The husband was in charge of all the finances in the family, period. I mean, that was, one of his duties. The woman's job was to maintain the house and to rear the children. Another little side effect on this thing too is that children were viewed pretty much as an economical asset.
Yeah. One more plow hand.
One more plow hand. One more people to take care of the animals. One more to help harvest the food. They were, as far as like the emotional life that we have with our children nowadays, that did not really exist back then. And the fathers would actually, because property, when it would descend, it would not go to the wife upon the father's death. They would play children off against each other to a certain degree. And it's okay, who's getting what? Who's getting what? Who's getting what? Who's going to be the favorite son? Who's going to be the number one son?
Mm-hmm. It's always about the son back then.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you could if you only had a daughter and you passed away. I mean, that the whole,
if she's single,
if she's single,
she could, but then when she married, she would lose that property.
Yeah, and whose property does it become?
The husband's.
Her husband's, because she's also his property. So that whole, I gotta have a man, I gotta have a boy to pass down my name. I mean, that comes from somewhere,
right?
I mean, I've got 2 kids, I've got a son and I've got a daughter myself. I never really personally thought about having somebody to pass on my name, but I've heard it so many times, and I always wondered, like, why do people give a shit about having somebody to pass their last name to? And when I was doing my research, I was like, oh, this is something that is I would call it systemic. It started with, it was important to have a son, because as a man, if I own property, I don't care if my daughter, took over the property, but I would, even though I'm dead, but I would hate to think that if I don't have a son, that this property could become the property of another man.
Yeah. Everything you've worked for, and all of a sudden it's completely out of your family, and
all because I couldn't, bang out a son.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that, and we sometimes you watch the old, television shows or documentaries when they talk about the, pre-1800 era, even way back to 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, the emphasis on producing an heir was just absolutely prime. I mean, you had to produce an heir.
And I mean, I think the average family back in the 1800s, I mean, the average kids per family was anywhere from 4 to 6. I think back in the 1800s, it was important to have it. And just a little aside, my daughter's the oldest. She's 17. She'll be 18 in November. And I was not, let's say growing up, I was not the best to women, right? I was kind of an asshole. So I had a theory. My theory is that the reason God gave me a daughter first is not because he didn't care whether or not I had something to pass my heirs down to, is that he said, you know what, Jamie, when you were growing up, you only had one wiener to worry about. I'm going to give you 10 million. And it's
changes your perspective.
It
doesn't
does.
It? Yeah.
It does. Cause now I'm like, and I see the boys, I'm like, ugh, he just wants to talk to you cause he wants to kiss you. Oh, he wants to go on a date with you. And she's like, no, he's just being nice. Nobody's being nice to you. But anyways, that's what the kind of family dynamic is now, is just, your kids have their own opinions. They have their own personalities.
Well, and you talk about family dynamics. In that colonial era, here in the United States and also in Europe and in other areas of the world, love and romance had nothing to do with people getting married. And that kind of seems like a little bit of a crazy, concept for us now, because, it's, it seems to be obviously it's the dominant reason why you get married, or you should get married nowadays. But in those days, the two principal reasons why you got married was to acquire property rights and or to move up in social class. Yeah, because you had a very, tiered society back in those days, where you had the aristocrats, you had a burgeoning middle class, then you had the low class and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, love wasn't part of it. You had a lot of arranged marriages, and
in America, mind you.
Oh, in America, yeah.
This isn't just a religious thing. This was, I mean, it just existed.
Yeah. I mean, it was an economical calculation, really, if you want to break it right down to it. It's like, okay, that woman's family's got a lot of property, and they're,
the idea of dowries didn't come from here, but they certainly existed.
Right.
Back in there, basically selling your daughter because it was it was the way of life. It was a survival thing. Mm-hmm. You had to survive, and there wasn't time for love, honestly, back then. I think if you lived to 60 years old back in those days, you were considered
old,
really old. I think the average lifespan was like 40 to 50. So they had to move quick.
Yeah.
So we start to see a shift, though. I mean, because nobody really wants to sit here and talk about how, everybody's got that family where my grandparents slept in different beds. Well, that's the culture they grew up in.
Right.
So does it seem weird to you now? Yeah, but they slept in separate beds, and they would scoot them together when it was time to have children and move them back apart. I know for a fact my wife wishes she could sleep in a different bed with me sometimes. With all the kicking and turning and stuff I could do, but I'm like, hey, we don't live in those times, babe. We married for love. So shut up and cuddle me, and let's go to sleep, and I'll try not to kick you.
Well, and this whole concept of coverture that we were talking about, it's crazy how long it stuck around. I mean, it was like until 1839, I think, was when the first legislation was passed, which actually gave women some rights.
Not many.
Not many. And again, we're talking about married women. Unmarried women had much more rights than married women during this phase. But
they were also looked down upon past a certain age.
Oh, yeah.
If you were unmarried past, 18, 19 almost sometimes, you were almost shunned.
You're like an old hag.
Yeah. You're like, oh,
so what's wrong? What's wrong with her? She's not married.
Why does nobody want to marry her? Why isn't she married yet? Because there wasn't a concept back then of, gays, lesbian, I'm sure it existed, but it was definitely not at the forefront.
Oh, no, that was under the surface and under the radar.
Yeah.
I mean, for
back then they were just
logical
bachelors.
reasons. Yeah.
Bachelors.
But so in 1839, you've got the first laws that started to break down the coverture thing, and you had married women finally, could be sued, could own property, could inherit property, which was a big deal from their husbands who had died. So, but it's incredible how much longer it took for women to really get. It took until the 1900s till they got like full ability to economically participate to some extent. And even then, they weren't getting paid the same amount as men were, and they weren't. They were not afforded some of the same rights. Still, obviously couldn't vote even at that point in time. And
I mean,
at
even
the turn
in
of the century,
in the 1960s, maybe a little earlier than that, if there were women who were single, like companies would hire single women, and if that woman got married, they'd fire them because you're supposed to be at home raising kids,
right,
not married. I can't go back. I tried. I tried to go back and understand why. I've never been a woman, believe it or not. I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to have somebody with. I don't know what it's like to not be a man, right? So, but why do you think it took so long to kind of start to recognize women as people?
It's just a male-dominated society. I mean, we still have, here in the United States, I think my law school class was like the first law school class in UC's history that actually was greater than 50% female. And so I think...
And you went to law school in 1754.
Yeah, that was quite a while ago. But I think we kind of grew up in an era where, we did not have... You talked earlier about growing up in the eras that you grow in, and you can't take your mindset from today and try to superimpose it over what people were doing in 1750. And I think that goes the same here. For us, it's not unusual to have women, be our equals. I mean, my classmates, many of my female classmates performed far better in law school than I did, and I can tell you, there's many formidable female attorneys out there that kick ass and take names, and for us, it's kind of like a normal thing, and I think women have made massive improvements in terms of where they are, and the glass ceilings have been broken to a certain extent in big corporations and things like that, but you can't. What you said is just 100% accurate. For thousands of years, you had male-dominated societies, and I could point to certain sections of the world right now where those societies are still ultra male dominant. You look at the travesty that's going on in Afghanistan right now. I mean, everything that we did to help those women over there, where they were allowed to get an education again. They were allowed to go to school again. They were allowed to work again after the Taliban had taken all that from them when they first took power. They're basically rolling all that stuff back again. And those women are going right back into where they were, and
that's all religion based, right?
Oh,
it's all religion based. And how first on how the Taliban and how they view Islam and
right,
because the vast majority, I would say, of other Muslims that I've spoken to are kind of like that. That's a little bit extremist, kind of like the far right or even the far left for that matter, because both sides of those spectrums are fucked up. And people might be asking right now, well, I thought we were talking about families. What the fuck are we here talking about women's rights? Well, because women, you can't have a family without a woman.
And you can't discuss the evolution of the American family without discussing the progress or the change in the relationship between the husband and wife.
Women fucked everything up. We had it good.
It was a good thing, right?
Yeah, we had it good, We didn't have to love them.
Well, but here's an interesting thing, too, that I found in my research. When you had unhappy marriages, and you can just imagine how many unhappy marriages you would have when it's not based on love and romance, but it's based on economic advantage and property, acquiring property. Yeah. There was a lot of unhappy marriages in the colonial times, and and this was the thing that kind of surprised me a little bit. They would separate. They would keep it on the down low. They would be very quiet about it, but if you had an unhappy couple, it was not unusual for the husband or the wife to go live somewhere else, and they was still technically married, but they didn't interact whatsoever.
Well, because back then divorce was not an option.
Well, yeah, and
in most cases. Even especially if the woman wanted it.
yeah, so divorce rarely happened, and a great deal for that was obviously a lot of societal pressure, but it was also very expensive. You had to have grounds for divorce, and the judges rarely granted divorces. So I mean, you were kind of stuck.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, what happened with these couples that separated? They basically had to wait until their spouse died before they could remarry.
And think about it, right? I mean, yes, we're women viewed as property, but a woman is a human being who has emotions, who has feelings. Property does not and cannot have feelings or emotions. So, of course, you're going to have unhappy marriages when you've got a person who thinks and feels, and you're treating them if basically they're a piece of furniture. I'm not saying that all marriages did this, but I would assume there was, when you're viewing this woman as property and heed my warnings and completely ignore their feelings, their emotions, their thoughts on how you should proceed, you're going to have a lot of unhappy marriages. So we from that family dynamic where not only do you have the mother, the father, you've got kids, but you also, you mentioned earlier, had aunts, uncles, grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
They all lived very close to each other.
Oh yeah,
Very close. So it was not uncommon to see, one kid go from house to house to house to house, opening the fridge, going from that. Because that dynamic, as far as kind of the nuclear family, let's call it, I think is what the official name for it is, that existed well up into the 40s and into the 50s, where even back then it was more out of a necessity that the families had to live close to each other, and that it took a village to raise the kids and keep the family going. It's because, you had your family blacksmith, you had your family of farmers, you had your family of bakers and candlestick makers and all that fun stuff. They had to. But getting into the 40s and 50s, where we're starting to see, more business evolve, that dynamic still existed, but we start to see kind of a shift away from, number one, the arranged marriages, but number two, that family dynamic of the immediate family plus extended family.
right. And you had talked earlier about the dynamic shifts, and I had mentioned that there had been quite a few that had occurred throughout American history, and here's an irony of sorts. But in the period between 1860 and 1910, child labor laws were enacted, and so children no longer were the economical asset that they once were, which actually helped the family, because it instead of just looking at them as
meat,
they actually looked at them as children that they had to raise and responsibility, and it actually drew the family closer. And then you had compulsory schooling, so now your kids are getting educated, and that once again created a closer family unit. And then you even had the creation of what was called widows' pensions. If you were poor and you were a widow, that you actually got a pension from the state. So you got all these things that are going on, and then this crazy notion came along around 1860, where love and romance
sorry to tip in my mouth a little bit.
Love and romance came in vogue. Ugh. It was like,
who does that?
Yeah, well, right. And so, but think about this. So you've got all these things that are changing and really changing the landscape of what the family had been like up to that point in time. And between 1860 and 1910, divorces tripled. I mean, because you had all of a sudden all these people wanting to get out of all these unhappy marriages.
And legislation enacted to allow it.
Yeah. Yeah, because the women had been accumulating more rights. And so they were able to, effectively go to court and say, this guy's a complete asshole. Yeah. And I want, I need out of this marriage.
And the men could do it too, because even back then, even if the man wanted a divorce, it was still pre-industrial revolution, pre-1800s. If the man was still difficult, unless you could prove like infidelity, on both sides, the legislation was enacted to allow it. But you said 1860, so you kind of have to ask yourself, well, why the change? Why the shift? Why are we starting to see a more focus on schooling, more focus on raising the kids versus them being property, women getting more rights? And it kind of coincides right along with the Industrial Revolution from 1740 up to 1840, where you start to see, mass manufacturing come into play, where manufacturing and just building wealth outside of farming and blacksmithing.
Well, and I think you bring out a good point. It wasn't altruistic altogether. An educated workforce is a much better workforce than a dumb workforce,
And it was needed.
right?
You know, we needed engineers to develop these mills. We needed people to work these factories. So the world needs ditch diggers, but the world needs engineers. The world needed scientists. The government, for all the bullshit that they've done, they started to see that, and they started pushing towards more education for children. Now, education in America, that's a topic for another day.
Right.
But
although there was some bleed over into all this, but
there's some bleed over into everything.
Yeah.
As far as the American family, it touches on so many different things. It touches on women's rights. It touches on children rights. It touches on race, even. So you start to see this push towards kind of away from this whole marriage for property, women getting more rights, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we were able to foresee what was coming. And we needed to. I don't think it was necessarily there. No, I don't think there was a legislator there going, well, this whole family situation is really not helpful to where we're heading. I think it was more of a reactionary, where we had this revolution and the family dynamic shifted as a result of that, not because of the industrial. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't think the family dynamic changing was intentionally engineered. I think what happened was this legislation got passed. You had people moving from the countryside into the cities. I mean, you've got all this huge change that's going on in the United States in this short period of time. Oil was discovered, and the Rockefeller family, and you've got standards of living, because heating oil became readily available. You had standard of living that was going up. You had people moving into the cities. You had schools. You had you no longer had 7 and 8 year old kids working in coal mines and stuff like that, and all these things. Like you said, it wasn't an intentional engineering of the family or an intentional shift. But all this stuff combined together to change the way the family interacted and the way the family was constructed.
The first change, and you had the young men of the family that were normally, they were raised prior to this to take over the family business, right? You're inherit my property, but you get into the 40s and the 50s and you start to see those young men going, wait a minute, there's opportunity out there for me to make something for myself, to not, do what my father did. So maybe my father was a blacksmith. Maybe I want to be a lawyer, or maybe I want to be an engineer. Those opportunities were now becoming available in the 40s and 50s.
Right. And you look at the time frame. It's interesting to note that tripling of the divorce rate between 1860 and 1910 led right up to World War I, which was 1914, was when World War I started. And women, for the first time, and maybe not I should, like Betsy Ross was making flags, and women obviously were nurses during the American Revolution and during the Civil War and stuff like that. So women did have an active part in the war role. But
from a historically what's considered as a woman's job.
Yeah, doing what were women's jobs.
Not my words. I mean, I said it.
Right.
But it's just culturally how it's viewed.
But when World War I occurred, and you had hundreds and hundreds of thousands and even millions of men going off to war, by necessity, the women had to take on some of the men's roles. And so they in World War I, that was kind of a precursor of what was going to happen in World War II. But that's when a women's movement and the right to vote really took off, was after World War I, and of course they got the right to vote shortly after the war ended. And if you noticed, we were talking about the Roaring '20s. So now that we're in the Roaring '20s, and marriage is stabilized, the divorce rate didn't keep
Continue to
rising
climb.
and stuff like that. Marriage is stabilized. Most women still wanted to get married. Most people were involved in marriages, and things were fine. And then the Depression hit, and the Depression had an incredible impact. You had people who were unemployed. You had people who were working for lower wages. Well, some of the same things that you see happening now happened back then. People delayed getting married. People put off having kids. And part of the reason why divorce rates declined too tremendously was because people just could not even afford to get married. I'm sorry, to get divorced. And so you've got this crazy dynamic, of the Depression just being a hammer blow to the American family and American family
Decimated.
formation. Yeah, absolutely decimated it. And one of the interesting stats, I saw was like in 1940, the American population in 1940 was around 132 million people. And so if you just extrapolate things, you say, okay, well, maybe half those people were adults, so you're down to 61 million. Then you say 2/3 of those were married people. Say that 1/3 of the adults out there were either looking to get married or were widows, or just that's probably a roughly accurate thing. That would mean you would have 20 million American couples in 1940, and this is still when the Depression is raging, because we didn't pull out of the Depression until World War II. We got involved in World War II. In 1940, 2 million Americans were living apart that were married. You're talking 10% of the American married population were not living together. And these are things we don't think about. We just assumed, back in the old days, they just got married and, they stayed together.
Lives happily ever after.
Right. And it just wasn't the fact. And these are kind of like the dynamic shifts you're talking about that occur because, wars happen, depressions happen. And when they do, it has a dramatic effect on the American family.
It's more nostalgia, right? Because
Sure.
like I said, we didn't live in that time. So we look back and all we see is photos of happy couples, and the photos you see of the Depression, baby, people standing in bread lines. But there were real people this thing affected the family dynamic tremendously. There were people who could not get divorced, who wanted to be divorced, but were unable to because they simply couldn't afford it.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm sure there are people who wanted to get married and had to put it off because they couldn't afford it.
Right.
And unlike today, where I get the feeling today that, some people just go, I'll just spread my seed everywhere and I don't care whether they can afford a baby or not. But back then it was thought about, wait a minute, I can't have a kid right now. I can't afford to feed myself. How can I afford to feed somebody? So you saw kind of during the Depression era, you saw a slowdown across the board, not only economically, but you saw a slowdown in divorces. You saw a slowdown in marriages. You saw a slowdown in having children.
Yeah.
And it was all economic based. I would say most of the part economic based is they couldn't afford to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah. And so you've got this devastating economic environment that's occurred up until December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and we went on a war footing. And then, we've all heard about Rosie the Riveter.
Oh yeah.
Now,
that she has created a whole new genre of women today.
Yeah, because for the first time ever, even though it did happen to some degree in World War I, we sent so many men off to the Pacific and so many men off to the European theater. The women had to take over the men's jobs,
and we're talking hard physical labor, foundries, forges, because most of those jobs were dedicated to creating wartime products, whether it be food, ammunition,
Right.
tanks. I mean, so you had women working in steel foundries. You had women working in environments that were
Armaments factories.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
you had women
Yeah.
dying in these factories as a result of just how dangerous the job was.
But interesting phenomenon also that occurred during this period because the men weren't home and because the women were working in the factories. You probably had your first instance of latchkey kids. And so you had kids that were coming home alone. Their mom was at work, and they had to let themselves in and fend for themselves a little bit. And it's interesting to note that because of this, the rates of juvenile delinquency, unwed pregnancy, and truancy, and just general criminal activity by kids skyrocketed.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's, we have so much of a focus now on, families without a father or families with, one
parent household.
one parent household. This is not the first time that we've gone through this.
It's not. I wouldn't say gone through. I think it's an ongoing thing.
Right.
It's been on the rise since the 70s. I think it almost nearly doubled in the 60s and late 70s of unwed pregnancies or unwed mothers. I'll put an asterisk by that because you had also people cohabitating, not married but still having children together. But there wasn't somebody there for the kids telling them, "Hey, this is bad. This is good. Don't do this." You need that moral compass. And in at least in my household, the moral compass is my wife. And if she wasn't around, my kids probably be around here cussing up a storm. They'd be good kids, I think. But you know me, I'm a little bit of a wild card, and that's because I was a latchkey kid too. I came home. My mom worked 2 jobs. My father was not in the picture. I got a stepfather later on in life, but he also had to work too. So I had to walk myself home from the bus. I was the oldest of 4. I had to, make the meals, make the food, and until my sister, who's 2 years younger than me, got old enough, and it seemed almost like a natural that she took over the role. Because I think that inherently women, I think it's inherent in them to be caregivers. Oh, on an overall base, I think it comes from a long line of back in the day when it was the men were out hunting and the women were growing in the garden, and there was somebody there to take care of the kids and keep them safe. Mm-hmm. So you didn't have that because the women needed to work. It wasn't an option.
Right.
Otherwise, we weren't getting tanks. We weren't getting ammunition. We weren't getting things to try to win the war.
Right. No, I mean, it was absolute necessity that, and of course they went through rationing and all that kind of stuff. And, there's a funny thing it's not funny. Interesting thing that happened after World War II. So you had a lot of these wartime romances and wartime weddings, little Johnny's going off to war and he just proposed to me.
That reminds me of that scene in Grease. You've seen that? You've never seen Grease, the movie?
I have seen Grease, the movie. I'm trying to think of the
Where
scene you're thinking of.
They're in the bunker. He's like, the bombs are going off. And he's singing to her, trying to basically have sex with her, pretending he's going off to war.
Right.
I'm sorry. It's tangents. It happens.
Well, and so what happened was after World War II, you had this dramatic spike in divorces because these wartime romances, of course, they lost their steam. And, you hadn't seen this guy for 3 years. He's completely changed because he's been through hell and back.
Yeah.
And
PTSD didn't exist back then.
Right. It's called a shell shock.
Yeah.
And of course the women had changed too because they weren't the same innocent little girl that got married when the guy went off to war. Instead, they had been hardened by the fact that they had, been through a lot themselves.
Yeah.
And so, you had people coming back together that didn't know each other at all in the first,
They were completely different.
Right.
Because you had the women who, like I said, they had to work the hard jobs, and also for the ones that had the one that had the kids, that responsibility didn't go away. They still had to provide for the kids, and then the ones who were getting in trouble because, like you said, delinquencies went up, just crime amongst youth went up. They had to deal with that as well. So those women developed either they coped with it, they drank it away, or they let it shake them.
Right.
Either way, any of those three options is going to change that woman.
Right.
It's going to change that personality. So the woman, the nice, sweet woman that you gave the flower on as you shipped off, she's not that same person anymore.
No.
And it's not her fault. It was the times. But
and neither was the soldier coming back.
yeah, he went off thinking, okay, because back then there was this nationalist, kind of to be an American, to go off to fight for your country meant something, from a cultural standpoint. I think it's less so today, but back then, from a culture standpoint, it meant something to go off to war. Up until you get to Vietnam, but back in World War II, it was, you were considered to be a good American if you went off to fight for your country. But bullets don't care about your emotions.
Right.
Bombs don't care about whether you're a good American. So they had to witness death, murder, hard times, sitting in trenches. And once again, you either coped with it, you didn't drink, but there's opium. I mean, over in Japan, the big opium dens, heroin dens. You either coped with it, you got high, or you broke down, just like the woman. No different.
Right.
Either one of those three options, you're a changed man when you come back. And it's not your fault. It was a sign of the time. So, of course, you've got two people who have changed dramatically, come back and try to make it work.
And it don't.
It don't. And if it does, they're probably homeless on the streets, both drug addicts.
Yeah. Yeah. They're just so, using the word shell shocked. They're both shell shocked from just the trauma they've been through, whether they saw a battle or not. I mean, it's, for the woman, they never imagined in a million years that they'd be thrust into the situation that they were in, and, having to provide for their children and having to do it alone, and not being able to care for the children. I'm sure a lot of them wish that they could have, and not knowing if their husband was dying or wounded. And, I mean, just,
there wasn't Instagram back then.
No, war is hell. I mean, and that's exactly what these people were going through. And so, again, going back to your term, dynamic shifts, the 1950s saw another incredible dynamic shift. You had young families and young people who had just been through 2 world wars and a depression. All these people wanted was a secure life. And you may almost want to say this was like the golden age of marriage in the United States. And it's unfortunate. It only really lasted for the 50s.
Yeah, a very short time.
But, you had an economic boom. You had
After World War II.
After World War II. You had people moving into the suburbs because they could afford to do it. They were living in nicer neighborhoods. They were living in nicer houses. They were, their children were going to really nice good public schools at the time. The husband was able to make enough money to support the whole family, and the mom was staying at home, being the caretaker of the home.
And not just from make the meal and that was part of their duties as well, but all from they started to be more of the loving, caring mother, right? There wasn't that necessity of make sure the kids do their work. There was started to be kind of this maternal, what we would call the maternal care, started to be more prevalent in the 50s.
Oh yeah, the parents in the 1950s were now much more involved with their kids and with the family unit as a whole. I mean, some of the corny shows, and we call them corny, that you see from the 50s.
Leave It to Beaver.
Leave It to Beaver, and
all the Waltons.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit later in the 50s.
Yeah, it is a little later.
But I mean, stuff like the Lucille Ball show and the Jackie Gleason show, and all that stuff shows an America that is very idyllic, and And to a certain extent, there was an element of truth where you had, art imitating life in that sense, because that was an era where people actually saw their lives improving dramatically. People owned, they just got out of the depression. Now they can afford a car. Now they can afford a house. Now they can afford some nice clothes. And I mean, this thing is changing. And the role of children changed dramatically. It used to be, prior to World War II, you had children and adults. The word teenagers came into that phrase came into existence in the 50s, and you had
at the soda shops.
Yeah, you had a different class of people out there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I still hate. By the way, I hate teenagers.
Yeah,
I'm about to have two.
They're rough on parents, I'll tell you.
Oh yeah. Oh, I kid. Like, why do you gotta have that opinion? Oh.
But I mean, you even saw that change, when you Hollywood and stuff like that, with the James Dean movies like Rebel Without a Cause, or Marlon Brando with the Wild Bunch and stuff like that. It was the
and you just named something that 90% of the people listening to this, they don't know what you're talking about.
Well, if they're movie enthusiasts, they will. But I mean, those were classic movies that just for the people that don't know.
If you haven't seen it, go watch them. I mean, they're good movies. They hold up.
Oh yeah, they're great movies. But it's about alienated youth, and your first teen, kind of punks, and
you're rebels, right? You're black sheep, let's call them.
Yeah, because children didn't do that before that. Children listened to their parents, they obeyed their parents. If not, the consequences could be pretty nasty. And then you just became an adult and you moved on with your life. I mean, in the 1950s, the average age of a woman when she got married was 20. She would live in her house with her parents until she got married.
Yeah.
Attending college wasn't a big deal for young women in the 1950s. They wanted to get married young. The birth rate doubled in the 1950s. And
it's called the baby boom.
Yeah,
for a reason.
That's right. And so you had this just crazy phenomena where everything lined up and everything was like, okay, we're going to work hard. We're going to get a nice house. We're going to make a nice family. And, people ate together their meals. They do family outings together. It's when I was researching this, I was thinking, God, come on. It can't have been, but it was. This was the way their life was.
And it was because there was such a drastic increase in the quality of life.
Yes.
That was, I think, the primary driver of this is you went from a Depression era, which was still, I mean, it's only less than 20 years old. At the end of 1932 was roughly the end of it.
Well, actually, 1941 until the war started.
Yeah,
that's when things. So you're talking maybe 9 or 10 years.
So that was the start of the end of it, right? That was the start of the end of it. Is 1932, and then so it was still very fresh in those people's minds. So when you went from not wondering whether or not you could afford a loaf of bread to what color is my new Chevy gonna be?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to be it. I'm sure to them, it felt like overnight. It felt like they just woke up one day and they could afford it. And I really want to preface this. When you say afford it, we mean afford it, not finance it.
Right.
Now, there was financing available, but I think the word afford in today's terms, it doesn't hold up well to what afford meant back in the 50s.
Yeah, right. Because everybody, I shouldn't say everybody. A lot of people today rack up tons of debt that they have no ability to pay off, or very difficult ability to pay off, and that was not the case in the 50s.
No, just because you buy a BMW today doesn't mean you can afford it. You may look like you can, but your life is probably not much more improved. It's probably worse off now because you just got into debt you can't afford. But back then, when they bought a house, there was financing available, but they were able to put significant money down. The cars they were able to buy with significant money down if they didn't outright purchase them. So that's why when we look back on those times, that's why it seems so idealistic, is because they really were that happy, is because they went from the worst economic times in American history to almost feeling like overnight they could afford all these vacations, they could afford to live, they could afford to eat and have money left over to save.
Yeah, it was a dramatic change. I mean, you can't overemphasize it because, like you were talking about, the food lines that were occurring during the Depression and stuff like that, and people were living in Hoovervilles, and a lot of those people that benefited from the economic boom in the 50s flat out remember growing up in Hoovervilles, or flat out remember not having two pairs of shoes, and flat out remember that their parents were, suffering, greatly, trying to support the family and stuff like that. A lot of people had to move, just trying to find jobs. And all of a sudden, all this stability happened. All this, television became a big deal. Everybody had to have a TV in their house. And, it was a societal shift, what happened in the 50s. And unfortunately,
Very short-lived.
Yeah.
One of the short-lived, in terms of the family just dynamic, probably one of the most short-lived eras that we've seen in our times.
Yeah, and I hate to say this because one of the big reasons that era came to an end was women's increased participation in the workforce, in society, and in education, because that was when we started dealing with two-income families. Women became more interested in attending college, so they weren't getting married at 20 years old anymore. They were going to college, getting an education. Then the whole idea of, well, I got this education, I want to pursue a career. This shift in the 60s, along with it, I'm gonna probably get my head clubbed in by.
I mean, you guys heard it here first. Paul said women ruined marriage, the family, and the 50s.
I didn't mean it quite like that.
No, of course not.
What women had finally was the opportunity to.
Women were allowed to have an opinion. Let's say that.
Yeah, they were now participating in different forms of society like they never had before. And this was very important for the women's movement, very important for women. But to not admit that it had a negative effect on the American family structure would be, it'd be ignoring the truth. I mean,
I slightly disagree with the negative effect. I slightly disagree with having a negative effect. It had an effect, certainly. You had an increase in unwed mothers. You had a decrease in people waiting longer to get married. But while it may have had a negative effect on how at the time that we viewed the family should be, mother, father, kids. I think ultimately the effect of the family dynamic and the women's participation in the workforce, along with a two-parent household, I don't believe that had a negative effect. I think what had the most negative effect on the family would be the single-parent household, where either, let's call it, for most cases, the father not being around.
But you had more unwed mothers. Certainly, birth control probably fueled the sexual revolution of the 60s to a certain degree.
Oh, free love, baby.
Yeah, free love, and you didn't have to worry about, having to raise a child.
But then the AIDS pandemic of the 80s,
Yeah.
the downfall of free love.
But you definitely had, in the 60s, I mean, it's documented, families began to disintegrate. They became smaller.
The shift of how we viewed families then began to fall apart.
Right. The view of the 1950s family fell to the wayside. And and obviously men are involved in all these decisions too. So, I mean, it's, it always takes two to tango. And I don't mean to dump on all the women here, but it was their inclusion in the greater society had that effect of creating a less stable family at home.
Yep.
And so once again, you had latchkey kids. Once again, you had, both parents outside the home. Um, divorce rates began to rise again. And you started seeing declines in the marital rates also. So, I mean, it's
And even among those that were married, you started to have even of the married couples, both parents working. And even though the marriage and the, let's call it the typical family dynamic that you might have seen, you had a mother, father, kids, all together in one household. You started to see even of those married people, the mother and the father both working, and I think a lot of that had to do with some economic pressure later on in the 70s, because you started to see a little bit of an economic crunch. Interest rates are going through the roof, so you kind of had to have both parents working. But that's kind of a little bit further past the free love phase. Even of those family members, you still had, even though they were married, and then if you looked at it, a snapshot, an Olin Mills, right, snapshot picture of the family, they look like the regular everyday family.
right.
But you still had the mother and the father starting to go to work, which means there wasn't that kind of moral compass, let's call it, for the kids. There wasn't somebody there to make sure that the kids did their homework, were being good kids, were making right decisions. Because not only was that dynamic different, there was also none of this other whole village, because you had a bunch of people living in suburbs. So you no longer lived next door to your mother or your grandmother, your aunt or your uncle stood there. Not only was the mother and father working, but you also didn't have that other part of that extended family there to help out either anymore.
Families broke up. Yeah. And something else that we didn't talk about in the 60s that had an enormous impact on society in general was the Vietnam War. I mean, that shredded the dynamic, that idyllic family of the 50s. I mean, you had families going to war with each other. Some of the family, a lot of the parents in the 60s, or older parents or grandparents, they were war vets. They in God, family, and country.
Going to war meant something.
Yeah, and like you had said earlier, they went for a reason. They wanted to serve. They wanted to make things right. And so you would have inside the family, somebody who it couldn't even be conscionable to them, or it couldn't be in their conscience that you would be against your government, and that
or
you
dodge
would not,
the draft,
or be against the war. And so you had this just fracturing of the family that occurred in the Vietnam War that was just tremendous. I mean, I know a lot of people now are looking at our society and saying, boy, it's really bad. It's really messed up. Man, they need to look at some of the reels from like the anti-war demonstrations.
Crazy.
Yes.
You could, if you were able to take some of them stuff from back then and compare it to some of the stuff you're seeing in now modern days between protests and riots, only difference you could see would be the picture quality.
Right.
Because you had this push in the 1860s and up to the 1910s of education, and that being the focus of the children. But one of the negative offsets of that education is kids started to have a mind of their own.
Yeah.
They started to have their own opinion. So you had a bunch of kids with, let's all due respect, most of them had fucking no real perspective on life because they haven't really lived it, because they grew up in the 50s as kids, one of the easiest fucking times to be a kid.
Right.
But they're also being educated and develop their own opinions. And it was those kids who were the anti-war people.
Right.
And that compared with the dynamic of the father and the grandfather, who it meant something to go to war. Like, what? You're going to dodge a draft? I fucking disowned.
Well, and just think of the cultural thing that you had occurring. In the 1930s during the Depression, Hollywood churned out movies about happy things and uplifting things, and tried to portray things as being better than they were. Then in the 1940s during the war, they were churning out war movies that were, all obviously total propaganda. But I mean, every country does that. But I mean, again, God, family, country, type thing. And then, when the 60s came along, I mean, the cultural shift was crazy. I mean, you had, rock music, which was, kind of came into its own in the 60s, and they immediately took up the anti-war banner, and kids love, they were listening to their musicians, they were listening to the artists talk. And you even had movies like Easy Rider that were just
a great movie.
Great movie.
Oh my God, that's a great movie.
But I mean, you had this whole, now all of a sudden Hollywood, instead of supporting the government, the narrative, the country, you had Hollywood and the music industry just churning out.
That's what was selling.
Yeah, sure.
It's one of the downfalls of capitalism. The marketing and the product, the production, everything's going to go towards what's going to make us the most money. Not necessarily what's the right thing to do, but where can I make the most money? And I think you're right. That certainly had I think you had this anti-war movement, then you had Hollywood, as well as music kind of jumping on that bandwagon, which just fueled the fire even more, which then caused just really this major, I would say, a shakeup within the families.
Oh yeah,
across the U.S. It's the first real time where I think if I was a father back then, and my kid even mentioned that they had an opinion on something, I'd smack them because it was probably fine back then.
So my parents owned a restaurant in the late 60s and early 70s. And of course, I was a kid at the time. I was like 10 years old, in 1970. And I vividly remember arguments breaking out in the restaurant about the war. I mean, people yelling at each other across at the same table or at another table. I mean, it was like, people talk about the tension now. I mean, it was tense back then. I mean, and
the only difference is you didn't have a platform to scream it to 10 million people.
Exactly. My God, if TikTok had existed back in the late 60s and the early 70s during the anti-war movement, oh my gosh,
These kids today think they invented protesting. They're just copycats from the OGs back in the day.
I mean, yeah, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people showing up for anti-war rallies. You're talking about Kent State, where the National Guardsmen opened fire on the students. I mean, yeah, it was a wild.
So that was
time.
that was a huge shakeup within just families overall.
Yes,
but you had also the women's rights. Just women really, really pushing for further rights to be independent, to be their own people, and a lot of that's going to have to be on the men, because we oppressed them for fucking hundreds of years, right? So at some point in time, they started to taste what freedom, what freedom was really, because they don't think they had really experienced freedom before. They were considered property, and then after property, they were considered the person that had to take care of the kids. And then all of a sudden, then they were considered the people that had to, make the machines while the men were at war, doing what they had to do. Now I got to cover for the man. But in the 60s and 70s, and in the 50s, you start to see, well, the women now are kind of getting to relax and talk amongst each other and really start to, for the first time ever, not to have this such significant role on as it relates to the man, right? They had to cook, they had to clean, raise the kids. But as it relates to the man of the household, there wasn't this tie with them. There wasn't this, you are mine and I am yours. And they start, and you start to see that push towards being an individual. So you start to see in the 60s and 70s of, wait a minute, if I want to fuck that guy, I'm going to fuck that guy. If I want to date this guy, I'm going to date this guy. If I want to date a girl, I'm going to date a girl. Because they wanted that and they deserved it. I mean, they really deserve it, but it absolutely shook up the household. There's just the overall family dynamic, because you start to see a doubling of kids born to one parent household. And you can look at any study out there, show when you compare children born to two parent households versus one parent household, the children born in two-parent households they just have a significantly greater chance of thriving and actually becoming contributing members of society, right?
Oh yeah, there's no question about it, and in fact, I've got some statistics about that. But one of the things I found really disturbing was the vestiges of the old system that still were in effect up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Concepts like marital rape not being possible. I mean, this hung around forever.
I saw that in law school, and I'm like,
yeah,
that's a thing?
Yeah, it's a thing. And the concept behind it, the legal rationale, was that when a woman made her marital vow, she gave consent to have sex to her husband, basically
whenever he wants,
on demand. And of course, that's horrible, and it never,
who wrote that opinion
should be based like that. But even worse, domestic violence. They used to call it chastisement, and you were allowed to chastise your wife as long as you didn't cause permanent injury, which basically means you could give her a beating as long as you didn't, cause her permanent injury.
And permanent injury, by the way, is a pretty broad term, because you could break her arm, and as long as it healed fine, that's not considered permanent injury.
Well, we had cases as late as 1983.
Think about that.
That said, where the majority of courts in this country were still saying that until the legislature specifically makes domestic violence, a punishable crime, they were without authority to do anything about it. Because even though there had been some laws passed about domestic violence prior to the 80s, they didn't have any teeth.
Nobody enforced them.
Nobody enforced them, and even if the husband, did something really heinous that they charged him with the crimes of the day, the penalties were just nothing. And so it wasn't until the 1980s that domestic violence laws finally got some teeth and afforded women some protection. And you really think about that, and that's crazy. It's not that long ago.
It's not. It's not at all. I mean, in relative times, I mean, there's a lot of people listening that can remember the 80s. And I remember being in law school and reading a court case basically stating that, well, women cannot be raped by their husbands. And that blew me away. Just the fact that even existed.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of that too, like women can't testify against their husbands in court, right? I mean, they weren't allowed to do a lot. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that, who was in our court systems? Who were our legislatures at that time? It was men.
It was all men, yeah.
So, yeah, I'd like to think that if the roles were reversed, that women would be writing the laws in their favor as well. Because it's just the nature of people. The people in power are going to write the laws that most favor them.
So let me, you had mentioned this before, and I found this little stat here, but children from fatherless homes are more likely to do poorly in school. They're more likely to join a gang. They're more likely to commit crime. They're more likely to be imprisoned, and they're more likely to use drugs. I mean, so that is, one of the things you had talked about, one-parent household and all that. It's really the father figure who's abandoned the household to a certain extent, and it's the fathers who have really probably damaged a lot of kids out there. But there's also,
we know how to fuck shit up.
Oh yeah. I mean, we fucked it up pretty good. And one of the things that, and I'll pose this to you because people don't know this out there, but Jamie is a wizard with technology. But there's this concept out there now that media has become like a surrogate parent for a lot of kids. Whereas parents that taught ideals and morals and the foundation to their children our kids are turning more and more and more to social media, to cell phones, to video games, to form their foundational beliefs. What do you think about that?
It's absolutely true. If then keep in mind, this is my opinion. If you don't have even, I think even just one parent, this hasn't to do with a multi-parent household. If you don't have somebody in the household that is monitoring their social media use, is being their, let's call it Jiminy Cricket, their moral compass, kids inherently are going to look to other children. I mean, let's take social media out of it. Before social media, when you were growing up, who were you looking to see what was the cool new thing? Your friends, right? You call them on the phone, you meet up with them in the park, you guys would talk and hang out, and that formed a lot of your foundation as to who you became. Now, you also had your parents who were trying to instill in you the right and the wrong, right?
Absolutely.
But you still had your friends out there that would influence you. And sometimes, the bad thoughts would win. What you're seeing now is, well, your friends are now, instead of having 10 to 12 close friends, close buddies, because you didn't have the internet.
And your parents probably knew the parents of
Yes.
those kids, right?
Yeah.
It's like you call, hey, Joey's being an asshole, and like, trying to get my kid to drink beer. You could call somebody up directly, but now
You don't have that now. Now your kid's got 400 friends,
Yeah.
let's say, and they're all posting things on social media. So as the parent, you're still there. You're still there for the moral guidelines, to be the moral compass, teach your kid what's right and wrong, how to be a good person. But the influence that they have is far greater now.
Yes.
Because instead of 10 to 12 kids who as a parent in a local neighborhood, you've got to contend with 400, 1,000, maybe even of kids who maybe span across multiple states trying to influence them. And not just that, but you've also got major corporations marketing these kids too. Because they realize that the kids are the ones influencing the parents' purchasing decisions for them. So they're trying to influence the kids so the kids can influence the parents. You have to be more vigilant now, more than ever.
Well, who in a million years, when the smartphone, which has kind of kicked off this whole craze, would have imagined that you would have influencers, people that could literally, they're being paid by corporations to push product, to push ideas, and these people have an inordinate amount of influence over the children.
They do.
Because what they wear is what everybody wants to wear. How they talk, how they act. This is how people want to talk and act. I mean, it is incredible. You can have some just absolute village idiot that's got 1 million followers on TikTok
Says
or
something funny,
Says something funny or does some stupid.
You
crap.
have to be. If you're a parent out there today, I mean, right now, I click a button on my phone, the whole internet shuts off. I get reports on what my kids are watching, what my kids are Googling, what they're YouTubing. Monitor their social media. More so my son. My daughter, she's older now. We did that with her when we were younger. I think it's important that you also monitor and respect that your kid is becoming an adult, and if they're exhibiting responsible behaviors, giving them some more freedom. I'm more of a dynamic parent in that, the more responsibility you show me that you have, the more freedom you're going to get. But if you start to slip, well, I'm going to take some of that freedom away, because it's my job as a parent to make sure you're ready as an adult for society.
Right.
And the unfortunate truth of today's world is that we live in a society where everybody's trying to influence you.
Right.
Everybody.
And I think a lot of parents have abdicated their parenting responsibilities.
It's easy.
It's easy. They dumped it off. They've dumped it off on the schools. They've dumped it off on social media stars.
I've done it. I'm fucking tired. I had worked all day, and my kid comes home. I want to play. Fucking turn on Barney, right? That's the where we're at today, right? When I was a kid, my mom, If I was annoying her, she'd turn on Star Trek. We only had 2 channels, right? So
Right.
so it was Star Trek for me. It was always on one channel, and that was my babysitter. And I've done that. I've tried to not do it as much, but when my kid was 4 or 5, put YouTube in front of them and watch this, and you can't do that. You can't live on that. I think occasionally, letting your kid relax and enjoy some social, media, because YouTube is social media. I think any technology that seeks to try and influence you in either way, in either how you think or what you purchase, to me, that's social media. You don't have to be on an app that interacts with other people to be considered social media, in my opinion. So we really try to limit that in our household because we want to be the ones who influence our kids, my wife and I. Now, might we fuck up and might we do it wrong and might my kids grow up to be shitheads? It is, but not because of what some Instagram model or some TikToker said to do. We want to be the ones to fuck them up. Now, we're trying not to.
Right.
But
and I think parents, there's so many parents out there that want to be friends with their kids, and
not me.
Me neither. When you're raising a child, this is my opinion. Your household is not a democracy. It is a benign, absolute monarchy. And I had this conversation with our oldest son, so many times. He's like, "Well, wait a minute, that's not fair." And I'm like, "Hey, this is my house. This is our rules. You don't got to say in it. I'll listen to what you say. I'll consider what you say. And if you make a good point, maybe you can change my mind. But
you don't call the shots.
You don't call the shots." And I made that very clear. And to some degree it worked. But we've got, we're just finding out now in the last couple of years about the pandemic actually kind of exposed this. What's being taught to our kids in school. And, it's pretty alarming when you consider this because, they're being pushed to learn ideologies that have nothing to do really with going to school. And
not science, not math.
I'm a big believer in school should be, the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, and yes, I know arithmetic starts with an A.
No, don't admit it.
And writing starts with a W.
Let everybody think you're dumb.
Okay. But we've got to get back to the foundational stuff here. And here's a couple stats that just blew me away.
And just so that everybody knows
What's
the
that?
difference between Paul and I, that's because they can't see this shit right now. Me, I'm 38 years old. I'm sitting with a computer screen in front of me looking at my notes. And Paul's got about 600 sheets of paper right now, which I think is adorable. But it's a different generation,
Yeah, I'm still more comfortable writing than I am looking at my computer screen because I can still kind of find it faster this way. But the national average for school spending on a student in 2023 is approximately $16,855
per year,
per school year. And what you have, and at the top end is New York with $39,000, and the low end is Utah at $8,900 a year. But Utah's students rank in the top third.
What are they teaching
in
them?
the country? Well, they're probably teaching them reading, writing, and arithmetic.
The 3 R's.
But here's the mind-blowing stuff. So we know that the national average per student is about 16,000 plus. In 30 Illinois schools, 0 students are proficient in reading. 0. Not like a percent, 0. In 53 schools in Illinois, 0 students are proficient in math. And taxpayers in Illinois are paying $20,500 per student in those schools. So they're paying above the national average, and their kids aren't learning reading. The kids aren't learning math. Those kids don't have a chance in the future. I mean, this is really, when we got to talk about societal breakdown, those kids, especially now in the technology world, if you can't read, if you can't perform some basic math skills, what possible hope do you have to succeed?
Here I'm going to share a little bit of a story that relates directly to this that just happened 2 nights ago. My sister just had a baby, beautiful little boy. We were going to go on Monday night is when she had it. We were going to go see her. I was hungry, so I dropped my wife and daughter off because visitation, they had different restrictions. So they were going to visit for half an hour. So I dropped them off. My son and I went to Wendy's to get some food. Ordered it. It was $19.55 is what the total was. I get to the window. The guy looks at me and goes, $18.27. I go, okay. I just didn't say anything. Just thought maybe he read it wrong. Get it and make sure, and the receipt said $19.55. And I thought, oh, that's just a fluke, whatever. Go back to visit. We ate, and then as we're all leaving, my daughter's like, I want Wendy's. So we go back to the same Wendy's, order food. Total like $16.27. When I get to the window, the same kid's like $17.42. So like at that point, I know it's not a fluke. I know you can't fucking read numbers. And you're making up shit. And because all you know how to do is take a card, swipe it, and hand it back to me. And this was 18, 19-year-old. And it's exactly that reason is because these kids are just getting fucking pushed through. Because the big shift back in the 1860s and on to make education an important part of our society, we're still being told that narrative today, but that's not what's actually happening. What's happening is it's fucking money. Yep. It's what it is.
Yep.
It's money. We need to pay the principal more. The school board, those people need to make more money. But not only that, you have the suppliers, who that are giving the school what they need. It's all about getting money for them. The focus is no longer on our children's education.
Right.
In public schools, my kids go to private school because I'm a privileged white boy. But in public schools, the focus is now on fucking push them through. I mean, the No Kid Left Behind, I think, was the worst thing that happened to our public school system.
When they started giving bonuses to schools based on graduation rates and stuff like that,
push them through.
And what happened? I remember when the whole Atlanta school system got busted for rigging their scores.
There was a teacher recently that got caught. The way she was giving her tests, because it was standardized tests, would in public schools, like I think it was like second or third grade, she would say, "Okay, now listen to me. 2 + 2 is either A, 3, B, 6, C, 4, D," and she was like significantly enunciating which was the correct answer, because the way that her bonus was structured, the way that she was paid, was based on her kids' test scores.
Right. Exactly. And going back to the point that we were talking about.
And I'm sorry for screaming in the mic if that busted anybody's eardrums. I apologize.
Mine are good still, hopefully. Baltimore, another city that, has been in headlines about their education system. They spend $32,000 per student, and their teachers make over 6 figures when you factor in their pensions. Okay, they're spending almost twice as much as the national average on their students. Yet 23 Baltimore schools have 0 students who are proficient in math.
And we're not talking like excelling. We're talking about on a national average. Are their math scores at or
for their grade level?
For their grade level, are they at the national average? Not above, but at the national average.
Yeah, and again, what the hell are they teaching these kids in school? I mean, you got teachers making $100,000.
Critical race theory.
Well, yeah, they're not getting taught the skills they need to be able to succeed. And again, a lot of this stuff is, and I've got this article here. Let me find this.
When you're looking for that, when you couple what you're talking about as far as the education, we talked earlier about it taking a village to raise, a child, let's say. Part of that village is the school system. Now, unfortunately, you're seeing so much of a push towards blaming the school system and the parents pushing so much off of that onto the school system. Well, clearly the school systems are failing, but you as a parent also have a responsibility to educate your child too. And what you're seeing is this: not only the schools failing, but because we have, especially in the lower income areas, such a significant increase in one parent households. Well, that one parent has to work, so the kids are latchkey kids. So they're not only are they not getting the education at school, they're not getting the education at home. They're not getting the moral education. They're also not having somebody there to make sure that they're doing the homework,
Right.
to double check the work, to make sure that they're not out partying. So it's really going to compound, and you're already seeing that effect on our economy as these kids enter the workforce.
Well, and even worse, because I saw this about the pandemic. Fourth and eighth graders' scores have nosedived since 2020. Because a lot of it, homeschool, not homeschooling, but they were doing remote schooling, which has turned out to be an absolute disaster. But you got these kids who are not developing social skills by not being at school, but they're also not getting educated. And the fourth grade and eighth grade proficiency scores that I was looking at were just disastrous for school systems that were doing a lot of the remote education.
And it really is important to understand that it takes more than just the parents to get a child ready for the world. The school system is a big part of that. And when you've got school systems failing, the parents, even the ones that are really, really trying, can only do so much.
Well, yeah. I mean, if your teachers, I know Donna and we watched this interview with a couple of teachers that was done just, I don't know, was that about a year and a half ago? And they literally asked this teacher when the Declaration of Independence was signed, what year. She didn't know it. They asked her who we fought in the Revolutionary War. She didn't know the answer to that. And they asked her, well, what do you teach your children? And she goes, well, I teach them diversity and inclusion and critical race theory. And I'm like thinking to myself, we have lost our minds. I mean,
and here's not because we live in a society where shit is. I mean, it's just shit's changing. It is. It just is like a.
Oh yeah.
A man is a woman is a man, and I don't necessarily believe in the whole America's racist thing, but I do understand trying to educate the children to understand that these things exist. I think why that's come into play in the school systems is because there's a failure at the home to teach those kids those things. That really should be the role of the parent, is to help your kid understand the world. Oh, that's my opinion. And that's what critical race theory, that's what diversity is. And that's understanding the world. And I don't know about you, but I don't want some random other person to teach my kid how to understand the world. You teach my kid how to add 2 + 2. I'll teach my kid how to understand the world.
Exactly. I mean, you're talking about infusing ideologies that are fairly controversial into impressionable young minds that are going to take what you said as gospel. Because, I mean, I know me growing up when I was in school, and I'm sure you were the same. If my teacher said something, it was like, okay, that's it. That's right.
Seeing my teacher in the wild, at the grocery store, blew my mind. I was like, wait a minute, you have a life outside of teaching?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that these things shouldn't be taught. I'm just saying it shouldn't be taught by a publicly owned, government ran, federally funded school, because what's being put, the shit rolls downhill, because what's popular now is trans, you know, America's racist. That's what's popular. And what do politicians need to do to get reelected? Well, they need to win the popular vote. So they're going to push policies that are directed towards what's popular now. Not necessarily that they even fucking believe this shit. They just know you believe it. I need you to vote for me. I'm going to say what I need to say to get that vote. So they start to enact legislation on the public school systems of what should be taught. So that rolls downhill a little bit further. So now we've got federal money going to schools saying, hey, you know, you teach your kids this, we're going to give you some federal money, some federal grant money to teach your kids this. So the school gets more money. And our kids are being hurt because of it, because some politician wants to get your vote.
I'm just mystified, though, how we got to the point where an educator, and I'm going to use that term really loosely, how they do not know what year the Declaration of Independence was signed.
1962. Everybody knows that.
Everybody knows that. And who we fought in the Revolutionary War, how they
Tahiti.
do not know that.
Duh.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but they're teaching esoteric subjects. It's like
they're teaching subjects also that are new concepts that haven't even been completely developed yet. They're not, like, math is a concept that's hundreds of thousands of millions of years old. That's well founded. You can't. I can tell you, I can promise you this right now, critical race theory, what they're being taught today, if it's still taught in 10, 15 years, it's going to be completely different, because it's still a developing concept, a developing thought. Don't teach my kids something that in 10 to 15 years may completely be relevant to them. Whereas math and science, that won't be relevant to them.
Personally, I think the civil rights movement was needed and was fantastic. Martin Luther King is actually one of the people that I actually like listening to his speeches that are recorded.
Amazing.
And here's a guy that for me was very formative, when he said, he dreams of a world where where people are judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. That to me is like mind blowing. I love that saying. And I always, children are not born racist. I mean, we've got a 1-year-old grandson. He has interacted with black people, white people, Latinos. It means nothing to him. He smiles at everybody. He holds everybody.
He just sees another person.
He just sees another person. And so,
he doesn't know what color he is. For all he knows, he's the same color as the Asian guy or the black guy or
but what's being taught in our schools right now is causing division. And going back to we're talking about the American family. It's causing division within the American family. And here's this article I was going to tell you about before. And we got some goofball politician out of South Dakota who took umbrage that the Family Heritage Alliance said that the safest place for kids are in families that have a married mom and dad. She called that statement dangerous and un-American. And I'm like, how did we get to the point that this person is an elected official? How did we get to the point that somebody could even say this and not be laughed, off the national stage? I mean, it's really, really, I do think we're at a critical point in regards to the American family.
Who is that? I guarantee you, she grew up with a 2-parent household.
Her name is Erin Healy. She's a Democrat from South Dakota.
So there was a study done where in 2020 where they asked a group of college kids, do you think it's an issue if a woman has a child out of wedlock? 92% of the students said it's not an issue. They asked them the same question, except what would your parents do if you had a child out of wedlock? Or sorry, 67% of them said it was okay that you could have a child out of wedlock. When they asked what would you do, what would your parents do if you had a child out of wedlock, 92% of them said they'd freak out. So you've got fucking people like that who take umbrage with saying it's better statistically, it is, to grow up in a 2-parent household. I guarantee you grew up in a 2-parent household. So to me, that's hypocritical. And what the problem that we're having and that I see on just an overall basis with people getting offended is, number one, you're not really offended. You're not. You're just not. You're offended because it might affect somebody that might vote for you. So that statement might affect a single mother.
And there's hundreds of studies that absolutely contradict, her belief that it's, not, it's un-American and not healthy and all this kind of stuff.
Well, is it true that we have the number of single parents in today's society is significantly higher than it was back in the 50s and 60s? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think just overall, if you're talking about race, let's call it, so right now, 13% of all Asian children live in a single parent household. 19% of all white children live in a single parent household. 29% of all Hispanic children live in a single parent household. 54% of all black children live in a single parent household. Now, that's a pretty significant number comparatively speaking across the board. So we do have kind of a diverse nation where you've got kids growing up in a single parent household. And the problem here is not with race. It's the fact that a single parent household still has to generate income. So that single parent has to go out and work. So that leaves the kid to look for other areas. Kids want to get older. They want to grow up. They need guidance. They want that guidance on how to live their life. And if there's not a parent to teach them that, then they're going to get it from somewhere else. And there is a significant risk that kid learns the wrong thing.
Oh, there's psychological studies that talk about exactly what you're talking about. And why do those kids gravitate to gangs? Because it becomes their surrogate family.
It is. It's a family.
Yeah.
It as much as is it a fucked up family, it is a family because they've got somebody there saying, I'll watch out for you. I'll care for you. All you got to do is sling this rock. All you got to do is rob this store. But you know what? I'm going to back you up. I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to pick you up. I'm going to take you places. I'm going to buy you nice things. Because kids want that. They want that person that will care for them and teach them the ways. Because kids are very, very, very observant. They see how you live your life. They see how other people live their life. As they get older, they become more and more and more aware and seek out their own personalities. We've as a society, we've basically ingrained that in them. Because as we spoke about before, there wasn't that, autonomy back in the 1800s. If you were a kid, you worked. And then the Industrial Revolution happened and
what's the old saying? Idle time is the devil's playground.
Exactly. So if you want to sit there and blame anybody for kids being bad or growing up and not being able to read, it's been a systemic shift over a long period of time. The only problem is the family dynamic has shifted dramatically in the wrong direction.
Right.
Because kids, we've given them their autonomy. We've ingrained that in them throughout society as we've progressed and as we move forward, but we haven't really ingrained the family structure into, if you're going to have a kid, even if it's out of wedlock, there needs to be some type of good influence in their life. Because the family doesn't just mean a mother and father. That's why it's important in underserved communities to have things like the Big Brother program, to have things where you've got positive influences on these children, because ultimately at the end of the day, what determines whether or not your kid is a fuck up, a gang member, a politician, or a lawyer is going to be their influences that they received in life. And if there's not somebody in their life to give them that positive influence, then they have severely limited chances. Whether or not it's a mother and father, or some type of other positive influence, it's just not going to happen.
One of the most positive developments, as we've talked about some negative stuff here in the last few minutes, one of the most positive things that I have seen, and I've done a complete about face on this position, is homeschooling. I mean, a few years ago, I thought homeschooling was a disaster. I just thought, oh my God, that, kids should not be getting homeschooled. They're not going to get a proper education, that kind of thing.
Not for me.
And let me tell you, I have now met, and many of them down at the gym, but I have met so many kids over the last, say, 10 to 15 years that are homeschooled, that are remarkable young people. And there is now a support system set up for people who are homeschooling. So it's almost like a mini school, but run by the parents, and run by the parents well.
But across multiple families.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's an important, because that brings the social aspect of it. Because that's the potential downside of homeschooling, is there's no social network for the kids to meet other kids their age, and now they're developing kind of those networks.
Yeah, and just in the last couple of decades, you've had homeschooling where you had less than 1 million kids being homeschooled nationally, and now there's 20 million kids getting homeschooled nationally. Maybe that's the family getting back involved in the education of their children and in the foundation for their children. And it gives me a lot of hope when I see this. I mean, really, it's a good development, and I think it's only going to get bigger because these kids are playing ahead of the game. They're I just saw an article not too long ago talking about the proficiency scores of the homeschool kids. They're blowing the test out of the water. They're doing great. They're doing great. They're doing much better than the public school kids.
Because somebody cares.
Exactly.
It's not about money. They've got a vested interest in making sure their kid knows what's going on. And the fact that you mentioned that there's a network within each homeschool, that's going to give those kids, because it's more than just about the 3 R's. It's you got to understand the social cues, the social environment in order to be a productive adult. And the fact that they're developing these networks to reach out, so this homeschool kid can hang out with that kid and to really develop friendships and social interactions, that's huge. Paul, we're an hour and 45 minutes.
Oh, this is long going again.
I know. Honestly, I got a little fired up there. I could talk about this all night, but
well, especially if we go down a couple rabbit holes.
Yeah, there's been a couple rabbit holes that I was like, we needed to avoid that conversation for a later day.
Right.
So what do you think about the state that we're in today? Just to kind of close things up, just from a family dynamic and how it looks.
I think that we're in a period of flux. Obviously, the family has weathered some attacks in the last few decades, and partially those are some of that is self-inflicted wounds, because like I said, there's a lot of parents out there who have abrogated their responsibility to instill in their children the good foundation and help them with their school, help them with what they need to do to be successful young people. But then I also think that we've got outside elements that have realized that by affecting the curriculums that are being taught in the schools, they can effectively achieve their political agendas in the future. But I think all this has come out in the last,
Yep.
The veil got lifted in the last couple of years. And so I do think that, the next 20 years are probably going to be very, very interesting time for families in this country. And I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. I always hope for the best. I hope for the best for everybody.
And I agree. I'm very hopeful as well. And to add to that, we can no longer look at the family dynamic as mother, father, and children. If we can sit here and complain about the single parent households, the unwed mothers, the cohabitations, the family dynamic needs to, in order to, I think, flourish and help because it's really about helping the kids grow up to be functioning members of society, is if you are in a single parent household, if you are a single parent, understand that, your kid is at risk essentially for getting in the wrong crowd. Try to get some other positive influence in their life. If there's a boys and girls club, we need more people to step in, because we can't change the fact that we have a significant growing number of single parent households, whether it's a mother or the father. But if we can get more interactions, positive interactions in our kids' lives, more positive moral influences, whether it's a YMCA, whether it's a big brother, that can take the place of a missing father. That can take the place of a missing mother. Allowing somebody else to even tell your kid what they're doing wrong, because that's also a big issue, is that single parents, whether you're single mother, single father, well, don't tell my kid what to do. Don't tell my kid. Well, you know what? Somebody should, because you're not.
Yeah.
Recognize that. Recognize that while you can do it, nobody's saying you can't do it as a single parent. It's a lot tougher on you. And if you're able to take your ego down and recognize that this isn't about you and your abilities, this is about your kids' chances of being a functioning member of society. Make sure that I want them to make sure that they have that positive influence in their life, not just the parent, but beyond the parent. If we can start to really, really push towards that, rather than focusing on the single parent household, but focusing on what can we do to make sure that these kids have a better shot at success, then the family dynamic now becomes more than just a mother and a father. It becomes a mother and the neighbor next door who's not related.
An extended family, which is what they had in the old days.
Exactly. We need to bring back the extended family, not in the meaning of aunts and uncles, but in the meaning of programs that are meant to help these kids. So that's my closing thoughts. I've had a blast. I don't know how much people are going to enjoy the conversation. I think it's going to cause a lot of maybe controversy, because people, there are certainly things we said that people aren't going to agree with.
Oh yeah.
But we're not here to make people happy. We're here to tell you our thoughts and you know what? How we got here. If you do want to share your thoughts, absolutely reach out. We're on Facebook at How We Got Here. Put your comments there, like the page, follow the page. We're on Spotify, YouTube, podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns? If you have a thought for a future topic, if you know somebody that would be interesting to be a guest that discussed the history of something and where it's at today, it's howwegotherejp@gmail.com. That's HWGOTHEREJP@gmail.com. And with that, I say goodbye.